Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. I'm back in the chair here. I want to first of all thank Debbie Georgiadis for covering Thursday and Friday. You might say, where was I this time? I was in California with our good friends at KYCC. And a couple of weeks ago, I was up with our friends at KJNP, North Pole, Alaska. So I've been in California, been in Oregon, briefly in Washington and Alaska. I've covered the West Coast pretty good, so I guess it's about time for me to make my way to some of the radio stations in the Midwest and the East. But we'll postpone that for a while because there are certainly lots to talk about. Again, want to say hello to those of you that turned out. And we had an opportunity to talk with a couple of our listeners at KYCC, had a chance to do a share-a-thon with KYCC. I understand they made their budget, and so they're all excited, of course, because the Dodgers are in the World Series. Although I've got a friend at KYCC who's a Giants fan, but I guess he'll be a Dodgers fan for the moment. And they're playing Houston, the Houston Astros. That will be interesting. Of course, I know a lot of our listeners in the Houston area, Corpus Christi and elsewhere, and not to mention the Dallas area, will be rooting for them. So I won't take a side in the midst of that, but it's been fun to get a chance to meet many of you. And one of the things I hear time and time again are about the issues that we cover that you don't hear anyone else covering. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to get into a few of those. We've posted some of those articles, one about the Russian bribery scandal involving uranium, which is hardly covered at all. And then the other one about what happened in Niger and the whole Gold Star defamation, which has been poorly covered. So sometimes they don't cover it, other times they poorly cover it. We'll get to those in just a minute. Let me just give you a heads up on what we'll be covering. We will be talking about a lot of different topics today. In about a half an hour, we'll have Hank Hanegraaff with us. He has a new book out called Muslim: What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. And that parallels my new book as well, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, which we are making available as well. And then in the second hour, we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. And then we'll spend some time near the end of the program in the second hour with Tom Grace. He has another one of these Nolan Kilkenny thrillers. This one has to do with genetic engineering and genetic manipulation, and so we won't spend as much time in the novel as we will just talking about some of these genetic issues that we haven't really covered in some time. So we will be talking about a lot of different issues, so I hope you can join us for the entire 2 hours. But before I get into some of the stories that haven't been covered, I wanted to come back to a theme that we've looked at before, and that is how this particular group, which is known as the Southern Poverty Law Center, has so often defamed various individuals. And the head of it said, we've always believed it's important to take on groups like the Family Research Council that have a foothold in the mainstream. And they had covered this summit, which is actually sponsored by a number of groups, Family Research Council with Tony Perkins, American Values with Gary Bauer, American Family Association with Tim Wildman. You can go down the long, long list. But one of the things that they said, in addition to criticizing the Family Research Council, is, and this is a direct quote, in which Cohen actually said, in many ways that is Family Research Council, they're more dangerous to our country than hate mongers who wear robes and hoods. In other words, the Family Research Council is more dangerous than the KKK. Really? I mean, I know that people, when they get angry and they are filled with hate and venom, they sometimes lose their perspective. But I love what our good friend Nick Pitts put together. Over 86 years, the Ku Klux Klan lynched 3,446 individuals. And to compare the good work of the Family Research Council with the KKK, that does not pass what I call the straight face test, but I thought I would mention that because it's not going to get much play. One thing you're going to be hearing a lot about today, we'll probably get into it more in the second hour, is the fact that the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at this issue of tax reform. Now, there's always been a question about, can we provide a middle-class tax cut? But if you provide both an upper-income tax cut and a middle-income tax cut, you're depending in large part on growing the economy to actually make up what could be considered a shortfall. So this is where, in this particular article, it says the Republicans on the House Ways and Means Committee are engaged in a high-pressure, high-stakes tax policy rewrite, are currently exploring but not cutting the income tax rate of people who earn $1 million or more per year. Right now, the marginal tax rate for anyone who makes $418,000 or more a year is 39.6%. Now what they're suggesting is that the idea of cutting that back to 35%, maybe they won't do that. And so the House Republicans now have said, under their current thinking, maybe people that earn between $418,000 to $999,909, in other words, people just below $1 million, would be in the lower tax bracket. But those who earn $1 million or more would still be at the current rate. We'll see where this goes. It has been kind of intriguing to see that. But one of the blowbacks, it says in this article, is if the committee Republicans ultimately decide not to cut the income tax rate for $1 million earners, much of the Republican donor class and people in sort of the Reaganomics community, and they quote one individual, Grover Norquist, who years ago we've had on. We haven't had him on a long time. But Grover Norquist put it this way. He says, I understand compromise, but why compromise with the sin of envy? He says, this isn't the dumbest idea I've ever heard of, but it is in the top 20. So we'll see where that goes. But we'll pay attention to what is happening in this issue of tax cuts. And, of course, that is one of those issues that sometimes isn't real interesting at its face than some of the scandals we talk about. But it does affect you, your family, and your finances, and especially for those, which are most of our listening audience, that find themselves in the middle class, to get more money back into your pocket that you do not have to pay out in taxes so that you can spend it on your kids, you can spend it on paying down your debt, or even have some income so you can actually think about a vacation. That would be a good thing. So we'll keep track of where that is going. But when we come back from the break, what I want to do is talk briefly about two particular issues. One that the mainstream press really has not covered very well, and that one is the Russian bribery scandal. We have talked about that on this program before, even a year ago, with Peter Schweitzer, because Peter Schweitzer in his book Clinton Cash really had documented this for us a year ago. And this, of course, is a typical situation where sometimes we'll cover a program or an issue on Point of View, and then months later, in this case more than a year later, all of a sudden the mainstream press kind of picks up on it. And this article that we mentioned last week in The Hill, and I've also posted a new piece that just came out by Andrew McCarthy, entitled The Obama Administration's Uranium One Scandal. So we'll talk about that. And, of course, if you've been watching the news at all, you know the back and forth between the president, Donald Trump, and the, first of all, the member of Congress in Florida, as well as the woman, the wife, who was a Gold Star family. And so we'll get into that, but really into the bigger issue, and that is what happened in Niger, which is the reason this has been kind of blown up. And some have even suggested that this controversy and the attack in Niger is Donald Trump's Benghazi. It's not, and we've posted some articles about that, but we'll come back and talk about that for a few minutes. Then we'll have a chance to speak with Hank Hanegraaff about Islam. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Meredith Dake O'Connor wrote about 6 reasons your right-wing friend isn't coming to your side on gun control.
I hope others will use this sort of format to express why people aren't convinced by many of the arguments put forward by progressives. Writing this may have been good therapy for Meredith to write, but it also served to explain to gun control proponents why so many do not accept their rhetoric. The strident activists won't be convinced, but perhaps others will see why many of the charges and criticisms don't have any impact on Americans who support the Second Amendment. One of her reasons is the fact that we rarely get to come to the conversation in good faith. Name-calling isn't exactly the best strategy to get someone to come to your point of view. I would love to ask some of the pundits and commentators if their goal is to convince someone or merely shame them and attack their character. Remember the Facebook comment by a CBS employee who was later fired? She wrote, "If they won't do anything when children were murdered in Newtown, I have no hope that repugs will ever do the right thing." Another one of her reasons is the simple fact that the loudest voices are often the most ignorant. Whether you're arguing for gun control or any other government policy, you aren't going to get very far if you get most of the details wrong. Also, talking about gun laws in other countries is irrelevant to her. Often the studies cited are inconclusive. But there's a more important reason. The United States has a Second Amendment, and these countries do not consider possession of a firearm a constitutional right. Most gun owners believe that owning a firearm is a right. They're not going to be convinced otherwise by critics who call them heartless and uncaring, and they aren't going to be persuaded by critics who don't seem to know what they're talking about. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's spend some time, if we can, looking at this Russian bribery scandal, its significance, and again, how this is something we talked about on Point of View more than a year ago. Again, the conversation we had at that time was with Peter Schweitzer. He's been on the program with us many times before. His book called Clinton Cash, The Untold Story of How and Why Foreign Governments and Businesses Help Make Bill and Hillary Rich, really documented something which has now appeared in more of the mainstream press. By John Solomon, appeared in The Hill. Last Wednesday's program, I had posted it on the website, and you can find it there, because John Solomon, as well as Allison Spann, say that before the Obama administration approved a controversial deal which was giving Moscow control of a large swath of American uranium, the FBI had gathered substantial evidence that Russian nuclear industry officials were engaged in bribery, kickbacks, extortion, and money laundering designed to grow Vladimir Putin's atomic energy business inside the United States. And this is according to government documents and interviews. They also obtained, interestingly enough, some of the research that was done, an eyewitness account backed by documents indicating that Russian nuclear officials had routed millions of dollars to the United States, designed to benefit former President Bill Clinton's Charity Bell Foundation during the time when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton served on a government body that provided a favorable decision to Moscow, sources said. And, of course, the big question is where, first of all, was Eric Holder, then Attorney General, because, after all, he joined Hillary Clinton on the Committee on Foreign Investment. And more importantly, one of the things that the Department of Justice found is that it just continued investigating the matter, according to this article, for nearly 4 more years, essentially leaving the American public and Congress in the dark about Russian nuclear corruption,
on U.S. soil during a period when the Obama administration made two major decisions benefiting Vladimir Putin's commercial nuclear arsenals and ambitions. Andrew McCarthy's also written about this, and that's one of the articles, matter of fact, the first article that you will find on the website today. And I appreciate what he has said. Andrew McCarthy, if you're not familiar, as an individual, again, has been on the program with us before, was one of those federal prosecutors who went after those who tried to bomb the World Trade Center the first time, the so-called blind shake case. And he's been following a lot of these cases over the years. And he starts his article by saying this: let's put the Uranium One scandal in perspective. The cool $500,000 that Vladimir Putin and his regime funneled to Bill Clinton was 5 times the amount that Russia spent on those Facebook ads, the ones that the media and the Democrats have suggested swung the 2016 presidential election to Donald Trump. Matter of fact, it goes on in the article to point out that one of the longtime political strategists for the Clintons is a man by the name of Mark Penn, who, by the way, has written some very good books about politics and statistics and polling and the rest, estimates that about $6,500 went to actual electioneering. He said, you read that right, $6,500. By contrast, the $500,000 payday, which was given to former President Bill Clinton for one speech in Russia, puts it in some kind of perspective. And then he goes on to say that here's the kicker. The Uranium One scandal is not only or even principally a Clinton scandal, it's an Obama administration scandal as well. And I would say certainly when you look at, okay, what was happening with the Attorney General at that time? He says, the Clintons were just doing what the Clintons do, cashing in on their public service. The Obama administration, with Secretary Clinton at the forefront, but hardly alone, was knowingly compromising American security interest. The administration green-lighted the transfer of control of 1/5 of the American uranium mining capacity to Russia, a hostile regime, and specifically to Russia's state-controlled nuclear energy conglomerate, which is a group called Rosatom. Worse, at the time the administration approved the transfer, it knew that this particular group, America's subsidiary, was engaged in a lucrative racketeering enterprise that had already committed felony extortion, fraud, and money laundering offenses. He goes on for pages to describe it in some detail. I'll let you read it at your leisure if you would like to do so. But at the last, you have to say, well, they were in the midst of trying to keep Congress in the dark. But let's give credit where credit is due. Sometimes Congress is the last to act on some of these issues, but interestingly enough, it does point out that congressional opposition to Russia potentially obtaining and then eventually obtaining uranium resources began to stir. And as this particular article says, as Peter Schweitzer's essential book, Clinton Cash, describes, 4 senior House members steeped in national security issues voice grave concerns, pointing out that Rosatom was actually helping Iran, America's sworn enemy, build its nuclear reactor. So again, when you give nuclear material, in this case uranium, to Russia, first of all, it doesn't just stay in Russia. It also ends up elsewhere, possibly. And so you can see the problem. So again, they talk about 4 House members. Let's at least give them credit. I mean, today when we're so often criticizing Congress as a do-nothing Congress, these 4 members of Congress were Peter King from New York, Eliana Ross-Lehtinen from Florida, who's been on the program with us before, Spencer Baucus from Alabama, and Howard McKeon from California. So this was a scandal that was unfolding, and this one you probably are hearing about mostly on Point of View, maybe a few other talk shows, but even though that article appeared last week in The Hill, haven't seen a whole lot of coverage of it in the mainstream press, which is why, if nothing else, I encourage you to listen to Point of View. The other issue, which I'll mention now, we might get into in a little more detail in the second hour, has to do with the kind of back and forth that takes place and has been taking place with this Gold Star widow, as well as the president. And then, of course, last Thursday, you had this speech, which a lot of people really appreciated, by White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. an attempt to try to put this to bed. It just got worse, and so you've had this back and forth between White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and Representative Frederica Wilson from Florida. He referred to her as an empty barrel for her politicizing this issue and her criticism of Donald Trump's phone call. But all of it really goes back to what happened in Niger. And you're starting to have not just Representative Wilson calling this, in some respects, Donald Trump's Benghazi, but you've started to see some of the mainstream press call that out as well. And so that's why one of the other articles I've posted here is by David French, because he points out that earlier this month something happened in Niger that's happened countless times before in our 16-year war against jihadists. And that is, an Allied patrol was lured into an ambush and American soldiers died. And based on early reports, it was a particularly vicious firefight, and American troops were unusually vulnerable. They weren't in armored vehicles, they didn't have readily available air cover, and they even had to rely on contractors to evacuate the wounded. And so the argument is that this is a scandal that needs to be investigated, and this one may be even worse because it does seem like the American troops might have been betrayed. So this is why you have one American Democratic lawmaker calling this Trump's Benghazi. Newsweek made the same comparison. You've seen maybe some of the Twitter posts, but he says, are these situations similar? And not in the least of which, maybe we'll get into a little bit later, they're very dissimilar in the fact that with Benghazi, there was a deliberate attempt to deceive the American people. And also in Benghazi, there was a U.S. ambassador that was killed, especially during a time in which a sitting president was running for re-election. We don't have the same kind of elements here, but we'll get into that in the future, because if nothing else, you'll be hearing that over the next couple of days and weeks. So I did want to cover a little of this. This might be, again, some material that you need to know about. One scandal, which I don't think has been covered well at all by the mainstream press. The other supposed scandal, which I think has been covered poorly because it's focused primarily on the phone call between the president, Donald Trump, and this widow, and ignored the bigger issue, which I'm sure will be investigated by Congress in terms of what is happening in Niger and what happened there, and any lessons we can learn to prevent the loss of life in the future. When we take a break, though, I want to come back and spend some time with our good friend Hank Hanegraaff, serves as the president of the Christian Research Institute, also has been the host of the Bible Answer Man for all these years, has a new book out, just an outstanding book, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion, as always thoroughly researched, and again, trying to address some of the myths and the miscommunication and even the misconceptions that we have about Islam. So we're going to spend some time with him before the top of the hour, and then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news, and later on we'll hear from Tom Grace and his book, Undeniable. Got a lot to cover. We'll do that right after these important messages.
From director Kevin Sorbo and executive producer Sean Hannity comes Let There Be Light. Saul Harkins is a man who has turned away from God, but a near-fatal car crash gives him one last chance to renew his life, his family, and his faith. Let There Be Light, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters October 27. More information is available at LetThereBeLightMovie.com.
Christianity is based in history, on evidence, and all truth revealed in God's Word is for our good, not just spiritually, but in every way. Point of View's mission is to restore God's truth in our culture, and to do it effectively, we need you as a partner. Your gift helps inspire people, young and old, from coast to coast to rebuild truth in their communities. Join the Truth Team today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Get off the sidelines. pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us now Hank Hanegraaff, president of the Christian Research Institute, host of course, the internationally syndicated Bible Answer Man, as well as the Hank Unplugged podcast. And if you go to his website, one of the things you will notice is instantaneously it asks the question, will Americans awaken in time to the true threat that is Islam? It's at equip.org. This book, almost 300 pages, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. It is published by Thomas Nelson. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have made some links available to Equip to find that as well. Hank Hanegraaff, how are you doing today?
Hey, Kirby, good to talk to you. Yeah, the book is available in bookstores everywhere as of October 10th, but for the first month, we have the book exclusively at the Christian Research Institute.
Well, again, I would certainly encourage people to do so. Of course, have a link to your website. And some people probably are aware of the fact that you've been dealing with cancer. So how is that going?
You know, actually, it's going unbelievably well. I've had 6 cancer treatments, and now I have a bone marrow transplant. But after that, I should be cancer-free by the end of the year. That's the hope, and that's the goal.
Well, very good. Again, I want individuals to be praying for you. And this book is in a typical Hank Hanegraaff format where you use the word Muslim. M stands for Muhammad, U for unreliable revelations, S for Sharia, L for Levant, I for Islamic State, and then M for major Muslim misapprehensions. And I know you wrote it in large part because you're concerned, as I said just a minute ago, that America sort of needs to wake up. Early on, you quote from Gaddafi, who says, we'll just take over Europe, maybe not with a sword, just by having 50 million Muslims in Europe, and it will eventually be a Muslim continent. And so we can learn some lessons as we look at what is transpiring right now in Europe, can't we?
Yeah, as usual, you asked the right question, and that's one of the big problems, Kirby. Migration without assimilation has been well likened unto the python swallowing its prey with a long and slow digestion. And what Muammar Gaddafi was talking about is the fact that when a country becomes Islamic demographically, it will inevitably become Islamic politically as well, and that is happening right now in many of the EU countries. And the reason that is happening is the native populations are dying out. They're self-aborting through euthanasia, through abortion, through gender fluidity, same-sex sexuality, and the like. And rushing in to fill the vacuum are millions of polygamous Muslims that have no intention whatsoever of assimilating into the culture. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is the people that are flowing into those countries believe Sharia is state, state is Sharia. There's no separation between Sharia and state, and therefore, by definition, they can't integrate into a Western democracy.
One of the things that you talk about in Chapter 3 is Sharia is state and state is Sharia. We are told right now, even in this country, well, if we want to have some kinds of civil courts where Sharia law is allowed, that's fine. There are real problems in European countries and especially in the American Republic, where once you implement Sharia, you really have something which is antithetical to the Constitution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we've made even in places like Iraq, thinking that we could enshrine some kind of a demographic ethic there when that's not feasible. It's not natural for Muslims to embrace Western democracies. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge, huge problem that people need to be aware of. I mean, it's the undertow, it's the undercurrent. Whereas we see terrorism, they're sort of the attacks like waves of the ocean coming in. They're visible. Sometimes you can become anesthetized to them. But the undertow, the undercurrent is this demographic problem.
Well, and again, it's just an illustration, again, why we needed this book. You know, again, at the Bible Answer Man, you've probably heard this time and time again, but deal with that for just a minute, the idea that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. Because I know that in some respects you felt the need to really address some of these theological errors. And it's not like we just hear that from, say, a liberal seminary or something like that. We've heard sitting presidents tell us that as well, haven't we?
Yeah, it's true. And it's absolutely false to suggest that we worship the same God. In fact, it is an indignity towards Muslims to say such a thing. Muslims believe that for Christian to say that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is tantamount to the unforgivable sin of shirk. Moreover, they deny overtly the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and thereby they also deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In other words, what I'm saying, Kirby, is they are tearing the very heart out of the historic Christian faith. So if you lay the straight stick of Scripture next to Islam, you find out that it is a crooked stick by comparison. It denies all of the essentials of the historic Christian faith. The idea that the Allah of Islam is the God of the Bible is simply false, both from a Christian perspective and from a Muslim perspective.
Again, we're talking today with Hank Hanegraaff, and he'll be with us till the top of the hour. The book is entitled Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. We have a link to equip.org. That is, again, the website of the Christian Research Institute. This is where you can get a copy of the book. It is fascinating, 300 pages, and again, so well organized, Hank, as you do so often, where you'll use an acrostic like a Muslim or one other words that you might use like doctrine or whatever it might be, and those really help us kind of remember some of that. But let me take on one other myth, and that is Islam is a religion of peace. How we've heard this so many times, but in your opening chapter, you take us through the stories of Muhammad, and of course, even in the introduction, talk about what it was like to be a Christian when Muslims took over various countries. That's really a hard proposition to put forward, isn't it?
Well, it's historically unfeasible. Islam is not a religion of peace, nor is the religion of tolerance. And you're right, the cultural elites want to tell us that it is, but it most certainly is not. And that's not just an opinion on my part. That's a historical verity. If you, in fact, look at Islam over 14 centuries of history, it has always advanced by the sword. Now, the fact that I say that Islam is not a religion of peace or tolerance does not mean that there are not Muslims that are peaceful and tolerant. There most certainly are. I had a Muslim live in our home for a year and interact in a very wonderful way with our family. Eventually did become a Christian. I discipled him and taught him how to share his faith. I remember a few years ago going over to the University of Tehran and Alma Tibetaba, the sociology university in Tehran, and meeting the Persian people as I walked the streets of Tehran at night, being greeted with acts of kindness and hospitality. I certainly recognized immediately that there are millions of peace-loving Muslims, but Islam is not a religion of peace and tolerance. And those that say that peace and tolerance are enshrined in the Quran are simply using double-speak. It is true on the one hand that there are Meccan surahs or Meccan ayahs, Meccan chapters or verses that sound peaceful. But those have been abrogated to a large extent by the surahs and the ayahs that you find coming out of Medina when Muhammad becomes a ruthless warlord and he enshrines inequity for women in the culture, enshrines the ethic of war in the culture, enshrines the sword as the way to progress in cultures. So the difference between Christianity can be seen in the difference between Muhammad and Christ. Christ always taught us to propagate by word. Muhammad taught his followers, his devotees, to propagate by sword. And therein lies all the difference in the world.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll chat just for a few more minutes with Hank Hanegraaff. By the way, if you'd like to join us, especially we'll have some more time in the second hour, love to hear from you and your thoughts. 1-800-351-1212. This book, Muslim, again, is published by Thomas Nelson. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to equip.org, and go to equip.org, and you can find the book there. If you find yourself saying, okay, he's saying some things, but I'd like some documentation, as always, in a typical Hank Hanegraaff book, there are more than 70 pages of endnotes that really begin to unpack and document everything that we've been saying today and everything that he says in the book. So let me encourage you to get a copy, to read it, and to learn from it. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about the Christian Research Institute and their journal and other resources, of course, we also have a link to equip.org. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Hank Hanegraaff right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Hank Hanegraaff with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And again, the book is entitled Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest-Growing Religion. And in the last section there on major Muslim misapprehensions, you use another wonderful way to remember this, and that is the word doctrine. D stands for the deity of Christ, O for original sin, C for the canon of Scripture, T for Trinity, R for resurrection, I for incarnation, N for new creation, and E for eschatology. And so for a minute or two, let's, if we can, maybe, Hank, talk about how, first of all, when we are maybe witnessing to our Muslim friends, neighbors, coworkers, whatever, they may have some misconceptions about Christianity, but how would you recommend that we actually share the Christian faith with our Muslim friends?
Yeah, and I think that's the operative question once again, Kirby. I mean, I think it's one thing to know something about Islam or to know something about Mormonism or the Jehovah's Witnesses or Buddha or Baha'i or whatever it happens to be, but there's no end to the way in which Satan packages and repackages the lie. It's hard to keep up even when you're sort of in that business, so to speak. However, what all Christians ought to do is become so familiar with the essentials of the Christian faith that when a counterfeit looms on the horizon, they know it instantaneously. So far better that we handle the real over and over and over again and become familiar with it. And that's the purpose of the acronym doctrine. It is to take the essentials of the historic Christian faith and make them so part of the warp and woof of who we are that you see the contrast. Contrast is the mother of clarity. You see the contrast immediately. And that's why I do that under major Muslim misapprehensions, simply because Muslims misapprehend all of the essentials of the historic Christian faith. And so we need to be familiar with those essentials. I oftentimes like to tell people that we are united around mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis, of course, was famous for popularizing that phrase or that moniker, mere Christianity. Well, that's exactly what we're united around: in essentials unity, non-essentials liberty, all things charity.
And so, again, that's important to really understand that. Of course, knowing the genuine, you can pick out the counterfeit. But it does seem to me that a good witness to our Muslim friends is to listen to them, because, as you well know, Muslims that we come across, some of them may be fairly rabid. Some of them may read the Quran every day. Others are Muslim only because they were born in a Muslim country and their parents were Muslim, but they probably don't know a lot about their faith. So sometimes we have to make sure we don't necessarily assume certain things about their belief that aren't necessarily there.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think that's true of Christians as well. There's so many Christians that are Christian in name only. They're traditionalists. They're involved in a tradition of Christianity, but really don't know their own faith. And so we can't assume that Muslims necessarily know the life and legacy of Muhammad or what is enshrined in Sharia or what is in the Quran. And I think what you said is the word of wisdom for the day. I think all of this, particularly in Christian apologetics, we need to learn to listen. We need to learn to ask questions. And above all, we need to love those for whom Christ died so that we reach rather than repel.
Let's, if we can, talk about what's available on your website just before we let you go. It is equip.org. And I mentioned the Christian Research Journal. My organization over the years has always been receiving that. I enjoy reading that. Of course, I find so many different articles. You're the author of more than 20 books, so this is just one of many books and resources available at your website. So when people, Hank, land on your website, equip.org, what do they find?
Well, I think a safe zone. What we attempt to do is make sure that the information that people get there is well vetted, that information doesn't get involved in selling and sensationalism and sloppy journalism and sophistry, but rather information that you can trust in an age in which internet lies travel halfway around the world before truth has had the chance to put its boots on.
And so, again, that's an important thing. You also have a number of featured Christian resources, so it isn't just articles by you or books by you. One in particular, I saw Mindy Belt's book of They Say We Are Infidels. Of course, you have the Complete Infidel's Guide to the Quran, and so there's some other books and resources there. So talk about how we could use some of this, because it seems to me that we have listeners right now that maybe have a small group Bible study. They might, we have pastors, of course, that listen as well, Bible fellowship leaders. How could they use this book, which has almost 300 pages of material, to not only educate themselves, but to educate others? Is there curriculum? Are there DVDs? Are there some other things that they might use to educate others?
Well, there certainly are other ways of consuming the book. You can get the book in an audio format as well as in the format that it is, and we are developing curriculum around it. But what I've tried to do, Kirby, is, as you mentioned, I always do in my books, I try to take a big subject and communicate in such a way that people can wrap their arms around it. And so you can have a Bible study where you talk about Muhammad, his life and legacy, but not just cursing in the darkness, but also building a lighthouse in the midst of the gathering storm by communicating the difference between the crystal Christ, the paragon of virtue, and Muhammad. Same thing with unreliable revelations. When you talk about the Quran being unreliable, at the same time, I think it's important to point out that the Bible is demonstrably a reliable authority and so forth. So I've broken the book up in such a way that people can spend time on the individual pieces, and it's kind of like the Bible. You have to understand the Bible as a whole, but to do that, you have to understand the individual parts.
Let me, if I can, take at least one call. We'll take many more after we come back from the break. But Priscilla, I think you have a quick question for Hank Hanegraaff. What would that be?
Is like in Minneapolis, Minnesota, there are Somalians there, and these are like the same Somalians from the region that are pirates, and they really hate the country. And so I would like to know, how do you share the gospel to people who, I mean, you know, they disdain and hate? How do you begin to do that?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, look, I have never been a big fan of evangelism for the sake of evangelism. I've always said that we ought to focus on equipping for evangelism, because if we are equipped, God will give us opportunities. I think that fields are white unto harvest, and with respect to Islam, we have a mission field on our own doorstep. So the real issue is to become equipped, and I guarantee you, if you are equipped, you will have an opportunity to communicate with those who have not embraced the love and grace that only Jesus Christ can provide to the human heart.
You know, one of the things I'm finding is a fair number of Muslims look at whether it's the Somalis or whether it's looking at Al-Qaeda, or whether it's looking at the Islamic State. And a lot of these Muslims are saying, is that what we believe? And in some respects, that begins to be an evangelistic opportunity. You may not be as effective with hateful people towards you, but you sometimes find yourself very effectively witnessing to some of those as well. So we're just about out of time. So, Hank, again, thank you so very much for the great, faithful service that you've done all these years at Christian Research Institute. I thank you for your many books. And I thank you for this book, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. Thomas Nelson, thanks for being with us today here on Point of View.
You got it, Kirby. I'm a great big fan of yours as well.
Thank you so very much. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. Priscilla just started us off, but I'm going to leave an open line for the first half hour before we get into some other issues. So if you have a comment or a question about Islam or about some of the other issues we've talked about in the news, of course, what has been happening in Niger, the Uranium One scandal, and, of course, a little bit later, we're going to get into that whole issue of genetic engineering with Tom Grace. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that. But if you'd like to join us, let's get your phone calls up and ready to go. 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear from you. We'll be back right after this.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we spent a little bit of time talking with our good friend Hank Hanegraaff, president of the Christian Research Institute and author of this new book, Muslim, What You Need to Know About the World's Fastest Growing Religion. It's published by Thomas Nelson. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, and I hope you do so, because we certainly encourage you to support your local bookstore. But if indeed you can't find it, that is certainly something that we've made a link available so that you can get it from his website as well. We also, in the first part of the hour, talked about a couple of stories that we've actually posted on our website, which I would encourage you to read. One has to do with the uranium scandal, which is now, I think, going to ensnare members of the Obama administration. A lot of it, of course, had to do with Bill and Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation. But that story hasn't been covered very well. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to have, first of all, an article that appeared last week by John Solomon in The Hill, and then this one that we've posted today by Andrew McCarthy, the Obama administration's Uranium One scandal. And then another story that just hasn't been covered well, and that has to do where the focus has been on the phone call from President Donald Trump to this widow, Gold Star widow, and then the intervention of everybody from a Florida congresswoman to the chief of staff and all the rest, which looks past the bigger issue, and that is the claim that this particular disaster in Niger is Donald Trump's Benghazi. So we've posted those articles as well. But since we talked with Hank Hanegraaff about Islam, and before we get Tom Grace on at about a half an hour from now, I thought I'd continue for just a few minutes on Islam, because I have a new book out as well. It's called Understanding Islam and Terrorism. And I thought, just as a way to encourage you, I might say if you would want to join us in this half hour and you get on the air. So you have to have called us and you have to get on the air. I'll give you a free copy of my book. I'll even autograph it, because that would be a way of, saying appreciate your listening to Point of View. But one of the things we talked about with Hank Hanegraaff was this idea of Sharia law. And Sharia is kind of the legal structure. And interestingly enough, when we look at other countries, Hank talked about how difficult it was to grow a democracy, much less a republic, on Muslim soil. One of the recent Pew Research polls found that 99% of Muslims in Afghanistan actually favor making Sharia the official law of the country. 91% of Muslims in Iraq, 84% in Pakistan. So you can see that you've got something very different. And under Sharia law, if you look at the history at all, Christians did not fare well. When Muhammad first began to present what today is found in the Quran, he was presenting himself as what is called the seal of the prophets. And that is, Moses was a prophet, Jesus was a prophet, but he was the final prophet. And so he fully expected that Jews and Muslims would embrace him. And when they did not, he then began to treat them differently. They were known as people of the book. And again, it is important to recognize that even though they were not maybe to be killed like infidels or pagans, In Surah 9:29, which is the 9th chapter in the Quran, it says, "Fight those who believe not on Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and his prophet, nor acknowledge the religion of the truth, even if they are people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." And that came to be interpreted that what you would have within a Muslim country, as the Muslim armies began to sweep through northern Africa, take over Spain, which became Moorish Spain, if it were not for the defeat of the Muslim army at the hands of Charles Martel in France, probably would have taken much of Europe. But the idea is that Muslims would have a privileged status, and Christians in particular would have a second-class status. And so they would not be allowed to build any building that would be larger than the mosque. And so oftentimes, if they had a church or church services, they could not raise their voices. They were, in many cases, required to wear certain kinds of clothing and things like that to really identify them. But even in the modern world today, where Sharia law exists, first of all, Sharia law actually puts women in a subservient role to men. This is one of the reasons why I've said before, it's really difficult to think about how, if indeed you embrace Sharia law, you could have a constitution that provides equal protection, because the rights of a man are greater than a woman. The testimony of a man are greater than a woman. And so you can look at Surah 4:34, in which it says that men have authority over women because they are superior to them. And there are all sorts of laws that would, for example, sanction polygamy, but also allow husbands to actually beat their wives, to divorce their wives for very simple reasons. And so the rights of women in a world where Sharia takes place certainly is very different. And, of course, Sharia law lots of times requires them to wear veils and a variety of other things that will, again, keep them from participating in a way that would actually allow them to be equal partners in all of this. And so you might say, well, that's overseas. But, again, we've done some studies, and one that we've talked about on this program before was actually a report called Sharia Law and the American State Courts. Now, this was done a couple of years ago, but even back then, they were able to find 50 cases of Sharia law already being used in the U.S. courts. And this is why you have a number of states, most likely you live in one of those states, that actually has passed in its state legislature a ban on Sharia law. States like Alabama, Arizona, Kansas, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, to mention just a few. Some of you live in states where you passed a ban and then the governor vetoed it, or the courts declared it unconstitutional. And so one of the things I've said so often in this program is, if you really want to try to make your case for why we can't have Sharia law in America, just remember the numbers 1, 8, and 14. 1 stands for the First Amendment, because the First Amendment says there should be no establishment of religion. And Sharia law would actually prohibit any other religious view, and so it would be the establishment of religion, and so that would violate, certainly at its outset, the First Amendment. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and I won't mention the kind of penalties that are handed down under Sharia law, but I'm sure most of us would agree that they tend to fit into the category of cruel and unusual. And then the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection for every citizen under the Constitution. But as I've just pointed out, Sharia law does not treat men and women equally, nor does it treat Muslims and non-Muslims equally. So again, that number 1, 8, and 14. That's just a brief summary of one of the chapters in my book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, A Biblical Point of View. And it's just one more way to begin to recognize that we're going to have a battle, if you will, a worldview and legal battle over this issue of Sharia. And if indeed Islam is the fastest growing religion of the world, we need to know what Muslims believe. We need to know how to respond. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Meredith Dake O'Connor wrote about 6 reasons your right-wing friend isn't coming to your side on gun control. I hope others will use this sort of format to express why people aren't convinced by many of the arguments put forward by progressives. Writing this may have been good therapy for Meredith to write, but it also served to explain to gun control proponents why so many do not accept their rhetoric. The strident activists won't be convinced, but perhaps others will see why many of the charges and criticisms don't have any impact on Americans who support the Second Amendment. One of her reasons is the fact that we rarely get to come to the conversation in good faith. Name-calling isn't exactly the best strategy to get someone to come to your point of view. I would love to ask some of the pundits and commentators if their goal is to convince someone or merely shame them and attack their character. Remember the Facebook comment by a CBS employee who was later fired? She wrote, "If they won't do anything when children were murdered in Newtown, I have no hope that Repugs will ever do the right thing." Another one of her reasons is the simple fact that the loudest voices are often the most ignorant. Whether you're arguing for gun control or any other government policy, you aren't going to get very far if you get most of the details wrong. Also, talking about gun laws in other countries is irrelevant to her. Often the studies cited are inconclusive. But there's a more important reason. The United States has a Second Amendment, and these countries do not consider possession of a firearm a constitutional right. Most gun owners believe that owning a firearm is a right. They're not going to be convinced otherwise by critics who call them heartless and uncaring, and they aren't going to be persuaded by critics who don't seem to know what they're talking about. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, now playing.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, talking about Islam for a few more minutes, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll get on to some other issues in just a minute. Quoting a little bit from my new book, Understanding Islam and Terrorism, A Biblical Point of View, from Chapter 5. Let me quote one or two things from Chapter 6 on Islam and terrorism, and to recognize that, as we've pointed out before, Muslim terrorism has really become part of our world today. That's not to say that all Muslims are terrorists. Hardly. Very, very few indeed sympathize with some of the terrorist attacks by other radical Muslims. But even though it is true that few Muslims are terrorists, it's also true that most terrorists are Muslim. And so we need to understand that. And even when we talk about ISIS or the Islamic State, a lot of people wonder, where did that come from? And an interview we did a while back with Dr. Charles Dyer at Moody Bible at that time, the ISIS crisis, reminds us that, back in the 1970s, Russia invaded Afghanistan, and those who were fighting Russia were called the Mujahideen. And in sort of an unofficial way, the United States supported some of them, and one of those leaders was Osama bin Laden. And so as a result, after Russia left, there was a power vacuum. And so the Taliban began to fill that vacuum. Now, the Taliban, the word Taliban means students in Pashto, and these were individuals that actually had studied a very sort of radical form of Islam in some of these Pakistani religious schools called madrasas. And so the Taliban began to implement kind of a brutal regime where all of a sudden women no longer were allowed to get an education. I mean, you could be put to death for all sorts of things, like playing Western music, flying a kite, all sorts of things. But nevertheless, the individual that actually assumed power there in Afghanistan was Muhammad Omar. And because of that, he was sympathetic to Osama bin Laden, which allowed Osama bin Laden to really kind of set up these terrorist training camps. And for those of you that are a little bit older in the audience, you might remember a time when President Bill Clinton even fired missiles into some tents into Afghanistan thinking they might hit Osama bin Laden. They did not. And Osama bin Laden really started what was called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda actually means the base. And so the base of operations was Afghanistan. And so the base of operations that he had there and in other countries really allowed him to carry out a number of attacks in Saudi Arabia, in Kenya, in Tanzania. But the one that, of course, all of us remember is September 11th, 2001. And those individuals were all members of Al-Qaeda. So then it was not surprising that we first sent troops to Afghanistan. Later, we also, of course, sent troops to Iraq. At that point, Al-Qaeda sort of decentralized. It almost became kind of like a franchise operation. And so as a result, the leader in Iraq was a man by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And eventually he was killed. And again, in that power vacuum that was created, ISIS, which now we oftentimes refer to as the Islamic State, filled that vacuum. And the leader of ISIS is, or has been, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State of Iraq. And so these things were all happening during the so-called Arab Spring, but it turned out to not necessarily be the case. So what I think we heard from Hank Hanegraaff a minute ago is really telling, and that is if you look at those verses in the Quran written when Muhammad was a prophet in Mecca, you have various verses that talk about peace and conciliation and graciousness. But then when he became a warrior in Medina, those various surahs or chapters in the Quran were written later, and there's what is known as the doctrine of abrogation. That is, the later surahs abrogate or invalidate the others. And so you have the kind of the classic verses of the sword, which you can find in Surah 9. As a matter of fact, one of the things I might give you as a homework assignment here on Point of View is see if you can read maybe just one chapter in the Quran. Now, I'm not asking you to do this for your morning quiet time or anything, but you could, if you have a Quran, you can read it, or you could look at one. You can, of course, go online and read it. But Surah 9:5, for example, says, "Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem." Of course, I just quoted a minute ago from Surah 9:29, which talks about, you know, that the people of the book have to pay the jizya and have, in a sense, a feeling of being subdued. And then in Surah 9:73, it says, "Strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be firm against them. Their abode is hell and evil refuge indeed." And so you have lots of those verses, which are the ones that are actually used to, if you will, really justify this kind of Islamic action. Well, before I take any phone calls, let me just mention that one of the other things I put in this chapter is something that I've just added because I thought it was appropriate, and that is what we hear is the comment that, well, the vast majority of Muslims are not jihadists, and that really is the case. But again, it doesn't matter, because in some respects you can see that that doesn't really hold water, because you could also say the vast majority of, fill in the blank, Nazis, Germans. The example I even used that came from William Kirkpatrick is the vast majority of individuals of Hutus were behaving peacefully before the genocide in Rwanda, but by the end of that year, the Hutus had killed more than 800,000 Tutsis. And then again, they're saying, well, yes, but many of these were women and children. Yes, but that probably wasn't any comfort to the people that were killed by the Hutus. And the other proposition that we make is that oftentimes when you have even a small group of violent people, the vast majority of others tend to just go along with them. The majority of Hutus went along with the flow Many of the moderates, Hutus that did not join in the killing, were in turn killed by their fellow Hutus. And that kind of sets up for the next question that I'm going to get. So we'll go to KYCC in California. Bill, what would you like to ask?
Yes, I was wondering why, if Muslims worship the same God, Allah, why Sunnis are killing Shiites.
Well, there are a couple things. First of all, they will, as I mentioned a minute ago, even with a Hutu and Tutsi example, sometimes the aggressive will kill the moderate. But there's another kind of historic reason, and that is that the vast majority of Muslims in the world are Sunni, about 80% or more. The rest are either Shiite or other sects, probably about 15% would be Shiite, and the Sunnis, which would be things like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, are convinced that the Shiites are heretical. And so you would see situations where the Islamic State would pull over a truck and they would have them recite part of the Quran, and if they recited it from a perspective that was obviously Shiite, they'd kill them on the spot. So as I've said so often, Bill, the greatest threat to a Muslim in the world sometimes is another Muslim, especially a radical Muslim. But I think the other part of that I make this case on the so-called vast majority myth is once an individual begins to bring about any kind of violence, sometimes the vast majority of others will kind of go with the flow. But a lot of the killing between Muslims, be it Shiite versus Sunni, Sunni versus Shiite, has to do with the fact that early on the Shiites believe that the individual that leads that particular group of Muslims needs to be in the lineage of Muhammad, and so they followed a man by the name of Ali, and then later Hussein and some of these others. And so there's been this split between the Sunnis around the world and then the Shiites, which are found primarily in the southern part of Iraq and, of course, then in Iran. So that's a quick answer to a question I get into in more detail in my book. And since you called in, if you'll stay on the line there, we'll see if we can get your address, and I'll send you a free copy of the book. But let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to spend some time talking with Tom Grace. His new book is called Undeniable. If you're not familiar with Tom Grace, he writes all sorts of thrillers and fictional novels, and spends a fair amount of time really doing a great job of looking at military issues like we just talked about. But this book is kind of intriguing because Undeniable gets us into this brave new world of technology. So even though he is a former Navy SEAL and certainly helps us understand the need for us to fight against terrorists, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of genetic engineering and genetic therapy and genetic counseling and some of that. And I thought it would be kind of fascinating. Of course, you'll probably want to read the novel, and I won't spoil the ending of the book for you, but I will get into it enough so that we can have some conversation about genetics, something we haven't talked about in a long time. He's coming right up, but again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the issues we've been addressing today, they're all available at the website pointofview.net. And as you go there, if you would like to listen to the program again, you can click that button that says listen. If you'd like to watch it, of course, we have it on the YouTube channel. And don't forget my Viewpoints commentary today on gun control arguments. It's all available to you at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
From director Kevin Sorbo and executive producer Sean Hannity comes Let There Be Light. Saul Harkins is a man who has turned away from God, but a near-fatal car crash gives him one last chance to renew his life, his family, and his faith. Let There Be Light, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters October 27. More information is available at LetThereBeLightMovie.com.
Christianity is based in history, on evidence, and all truth revealed in God's Word is for our good, not just spiritually, but in every way. Point of View's mission is to restore God's truth in our culture, and to do it effectively, we need you as a partner. Your gift helps inspire people, young and old, from coast to coast to rebuild truth in their communities. Join the Truth Team today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Get off the sidelines. pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, and as I mentioned, we're going to be talking with Tom Grace. And if you're not familiar with some of his books, just fascinating. Again, an individual that served this country as a Navy SEAL and has been writing all sorts of thrillers, including Spiderweb and Quantum and Dark Ice, Fatal Orbit, The Secret Cardinal. This one, though, gets us into a topic we've discussed in the past, but it's been quite some time, and that is the whole area of genetic engineering, artificial reproduction. The book is entitled Undeniable. We have information about him and the book on our website. And, of course, we have up until now been also talking about another issue that he's been addressing, that is the fight against terrorism and the rest, so we might get into that again. But first of all, want to welcome to the program Tom Grace. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
I'm happy to be here, Kirby.
You know, again, you are an architect and, of course, served as a Navy SEAL, and yet you had to... Oh, you did not? Okay.
No, the main.
I'm sorry. I misread that. I misread that. My bad. But nevertheless, as an architect, you've had to learn about a lot of important issues, including this whole area of genetics, which I think is kind of intriguing because most of us don't really know enough about the science. But you've really kind of been digging into this, haven't you, in a way that has caused you some concerns.
About 20 years ago, I designed the world's first human applications lab for gene therapy. And it's fascinating because I have to learn what the researchers are going to do in the place in order to design a place for them to do it. And so I know more about genetic engineering than an architect should ever have to know. But it's fascinating about how all this stuff works and working with state police crime labs and the whole idea of how they process this information. We've only been using DNA in courts of law since 1987, 88. And we've come to expect that the DNA testing that they do in the forensic lab is true. It's going to provide an objective truth in the case, determine, so-and-so, it's a high probability of being the father or being the murderer, whatever you see. But what you see on the TV shows makes it look like it gets an absolute, person. But you have to understand how it really works, and that's where this thing's getting a little fuzzy right now, is we're getting too good at manipulating DNA.
Let's talk about that analysis, and I did not know that part because I, like a lot of individuals, would have thought that once you do a DNA match, that would be the case. But from what I understand from some of the material that you have made available here, it's just a few of the strands of DNA rather than the entire, 6 billion base pair studies.
Exactly.
So
it took 13 years to read the 6 billion base pairs in one person. It took 13 years to do that, and they did it faster than they thought. They thought it would take 15. They did it in 13. So what they're doing on these TV shows and what they do in real life is they look at 13 small areas, and they know where these things are. They can find them. Everybody has these 13 areas, and there's these repeating pieces of DNA that are in those things. They're called the standard repeats, and the repeat may be different from one person to the next. And if you look at 13 of them, that usually gives you mathematically a really good probability that you've found someone, or at least someone who could be in the group of people. So that's the neat thing is when they do one of these tests, whether it's a paternity test or they're swabbing the crime scene for DNA, what you get back is a report that says the DNA from this person is excluded from the group of people who could have left this DNA in this location, or is included in the group of people who could have done it, and by this probability. So like in a paternity test, they would say, we think this person could be the father with a 95% probability. That just means he's in the group of people that have these repeats. And it turns out it's not like it's 1 in a billion. It's a lot smaller group. But, I mean, there's more people that could match those 13 repeats than you would think. So you really need other evidence to convict someone of a crime.
And
DNA is usually not enough. There has to be some other things that will kind of push you over the threshold.
And again, because it's science, immediately kind of bow down and don't think about it anymore. But let's talk about...
But it's just math.
Yeah, just math. But let's talk about the book for just a minute because, again, we don't want to give away all of the story. But nevertheless, here is an individual that Nolan Kilkenny, who is an individual desperately trying to save the life of a young boy with a deadly genetic disorder. And I don't think I'm giving away too much that the boy dies. But they find, according to the genetic testing, that Nolan and the boy share the same biological father. Tell us more.
And that's the question. Is here Nolan knows his father is a widower, and is not the kind of guy who sleeps around. So how could this kid be Nolan's biological brother? And it turns out it's because we're getting so good with DNA that it's possible to spoof a paternity test in this regard. You could actually manufacture this thing. We had the situation in the University of Oregon in China just this year announced that they were able to use CRISPR technology to edit a single-celled embryo. So basically they made it an IVF child, a vitro fertilization child in the test tube baby. They went in and edited a defect that they knew was in this child because they built it that way, and they corrected it. And then they let the child continue to divide the cells into a big blob of cells, took a few cells out, looked at them, and sure enough, the error was gone. They basically cured a genetic disease. Well, that's kind of a cool thing, but if you can edit that, what's to stop me from going in and editing those 13 areas that would spoof a paternity test? And when you do the blood draw and run it through, sure enough, it passes the paternity test, shows this guy did it, even though he didn't do it.
Wow. This is just fascinating.
So you could, yeah, and you could do that with a crime scene as well. You just have to know how the state police does this kind of work, or the FBI processes forensic information, know what they're looking for, and give them the pieces that they're looking for. And you could solve the crime scene with false DNA.
False DNA. We've always talked about planting evidence and all the rest. Well, this is genetic evidence. And, go ahead.
Well, I've wrapped a thriller around a real situation that we could be seeing in the near future as we get better and better at working with DNA. You stop thinking of it as the molecule of life, and you start thinking about it as a data stream. We're using it in computers right now. We're building things out of DNA. That's how good we're getting with it. So if you can do these kind of things, that means you can falsify the evidence, just like you can make a photograph with Abraham Lincoln looking like he's on a date with Marilyn Monroe, and it looks perfect. You know it never happened, but it's just data.
Wow, fascinating. One of the things you also talk about here is with the new, what I guess is called CRISPR technologies, we were able to edit all sorts of DNA. So this gets us into kind of the brave new world, because you can not only edit out a defect like you talked about, but you could edit in. And if parents said, well, I want a child with artistic ability or athletic ability, I want a clone of Michael Jordan or those kinds of things, what before seemed like science fiction now could be science fact, couldn't it?
That could be, or if you remember a certain group of people back in the 1930s who thought that blonde hair and blue eyes were a good idea, and that everybody should have those, and that was the ideal for the master race. It's a process called eugenics. We pretty much don't like it. In fact, genetic diversity is actually healthy for the species, that we don't amplify defects like you have in purebred dogs. You get German Shepherds and they have the bad hips. That's because they've been overbred into a very small genome, whereas if you mix it up a little bit, you actually make a healthier breed. That's what genetics has taught us over the years. But so that's where law and morality and ethics tend to lag behind what we can do scientifically. I mean, the CRISPR technology is inert. It's not good, it's not evil, but it's what somebody might decide to do with it.
The book is entitled Undeniable, 370 pages, Nolan Kilkenny thriller. It is written by, again, Tom Grace, who's with us. And, there's another aspect of that, and that is our laws right now are really far behind. I don't expect our legislatures and our legislators and our members of Congress or even our president to understand all this about genetics. But at the same time, a lot of this is unfolding. Paternity suits and questions about whether or not embryo transfer is going to take place, or whether individuals that maybe have frozen sperm or egg are going to be liable. These are all very important legal questions that are going to surface, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. With the idea of frozen embryos, a couple freezes some embryos because they know there's going to be a problem. Maybe the man's got testicular cancer. They remove his organs so he's infertile after that, but they make a couple embryos and have them frozen off to the side. The couple gets divorced. Are they property? Are they people? That whole thing. We had the case in Kansas just recently where a lesbian couple contracted through Craigslist a gentleman to be a material vendor to provide sperm so that one of them could be a biological mother. They signed off on his rights. He has no parental rights to this child. He's cleared. He's just a material vendor, and he left. The couple later broke up, so the mother of the biological child and the child went on welfare. Under Kansas law, the biological father has to pay. Because they didn't use a licensed artificial insemination facility, a registered people, certified, they were able to get him on that, even though he'd been signed off as parental responsibility, because the law didn't imagine you could make children in any other way than a man and a woman and letting nature take its course. And now when you could do these things in a lab where you could have cells, gamete cells, the kind of reproductive cells made out of other parts of the body from stem cells, sort of reverse engineered, that's a great boon to infertile couples. But it would allow two men to get together with a donor egg and maybe a surrogate womb, and you could have a biological mother, mitochondrial-wise, two biological fathers, and a birth mother. The law can't comprehend that.
It certainly can.
There's too many people involved in making a human being. So our reproductive technology is going in directions that we just can't fathom.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Tom Grace, and take some more of your phone calls. All that coming up right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about some of the advances in human genetics, cloning, stem cell research, and all the rest. Science fiction has become science fact. And again, we're talking with Tom Grace. His book is entitled Undeniable. We also have a link to his website, tomgrace.net, so you can get any of those books. This is the 6th one in the series. And Tom, you were talking about what some people might think was a hypothetical scenario, but I remember years ago you had Mr. and Mrs. Rios. They went to a sperm bank, and they went to a place where they were doing in vitro fertilization because they had to use another anonymous sperm since he was infertile. They were then going to implant one embryo and froze the other 2. Well, they died in a plane crash, and so they were talking about whether or not to implant those other frozen embryos. And so you'd have Mr. and Mrs. Rios, an anonymous sperm donor, a surrogate mother, and then probably a child that would be given up for adoption to another father and mother. So you could have potentially 6, quote, parents. Now, the law was never made to think that through. As a Christian, I don't know how the Bible sorts all of that out, and it just, I think, illustrates exactly what you are kind of raising in this book. We're moving so fast with genetics, so fast with areas of reproductive technology, the law just simply can't catch up, can it?
It can't. And when you think about the embryos that are frozen, these snowflake babies, okay, are they property? Are they people? If they're people, then you have the whole right to life issue. At what point is life at the point of conception? Is it the point when you're born? If you're not born, but you're not in the womb, what constitutional rights do you have? I mean, the legal and ethical impact of all of this is well beyond anything that our legal system has envisioned.
Incredible. What would you want people to learn as they read your books? Because you are really kind of taking them through this fascinating world of Nolan Kilkenny. It's a thriller series. This one, of course, is on genetics. But talk about the others, because I want to point people to your website, tomgrace.net. Of course, this is a Regnery fiction book they probably can find in their local bookstore. But what will they find when they land at your website?
They will find the 6 Nolan Kilkenny books, and then I have the one standalone thriller, The Liberty Intrigue. The Nolan Kilkenny books all take some aspect of technology or something new that's coming up, and I explain enough to make the reader understand what's going on and why it's going from a theoretical idea to something that's valuable. Because at that point, that's when people are willing to steal it and willing to kill for it. And the rest of it is just a fast-paced, page-turning thriller. But it's wrapped around these intriguing ideas. And then there's one book in there, the Secret Cardinal, that actually deals with the conflict between China and the Vatican over the imprisoned church. And it's a jailbreak thriller that's set amid this political conflict between the largest country in the world and the tiniest country in the world, these two superpowers. And then on the side is the Liberty Intrigue, which was a separate book because it really didn't work well for Nolan. And the idea was a self-made billionaire, political outsider decides to make an improbable run for the presidency of the United States against a committed lifelong politician. And just 4 years ago, and who would have thought that I was just 4 years too early.
Yeah, you certainly were. I mean, that's fascinating. Again, that's Liberty Intrigue. And, of course, we mentioned some of the other books that are part of that as well, like Quantum and Fatal Orbit and Cardinal and some of the rest. So, again, we have a link to tomgrace.net. Thank you for educating us a little bit on this whole area of genetic engineering. Just fascinating. And thank you for your page turners. And thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Again, let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, get back to one of the other issues we addressed, and that is Bob in California. Bob, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you for having me.
What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yeah, I think what I wanted to discuss, just as an extremely devout Christian, struggling with some of the some of the moral questions about Jesus, in the sense of judge not lest he be judged, nor mock a man for the sliver in his eye when there's a log in our own. When I think of the service I provided to the U.S. in North Africa, the Near East, the Middle East, and the war on terror, I sometimes wonder if it's a war of terror. As Christians, I look at the toll we've had in Operation Iraqi Freedom. I look at our support for Osama bin Laden originally during the Russian period in Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. As first and second cousins of Jews and Muslims, Christians need to take awareness of the context in which we judge Muslims in general, and certainly fundamental Islamic terrorists. There's no doubt I've seen firsthand the just outrageous cruelty of fundamentalist Islam. But when I look at the numbers, if you're just tallying up the tolls of children and innocents killed in lands that we were supposedly bringing freedom and Christian values to, it's very hard for us to justify our own stance. I have a hard time wondering what Jesus would think of our Christians fighting this war on terror, which resembles, as I said, more and more almost a war of terror, and how we're ever going to get out of this mess. Sharia law, et cetera, is clearly backwards to our minds and to, frankly, any civilized country's minds. But I have trouble sometimes making blanket statements against Muslims, even as a Christian. I think we're very close in some of our core values. And I sometimes think the public rap we give to Muslims is at times hypocritical in the way we behaved in the Middle East in the last 10 to 15 years.
Well, and I certainly would agree. First of all, on this program many times we've talked about, is it possible to really grow a democracy, much less kind of an American republic in Muslim soil? I'm not sure that it is, and a lot of people have had questions about that. And whether it's in my books or in even as I asked Hank Hanegraaff in the first hour, how do we witness to our Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers? So, you have both the Romans 13, government does not bear the sword for nothing, so we certainly want to protect us from those who would want to do us harm, but also recognizing a very high percentage of Muslims, they just want the American dream, especially the ones that come to this country. They mostly come here because they want to get away from all of that. They want to live in a place where there's freedom. But at the same time, if we don't have assimilation, we might find ourselves once again dealing with some of the issues that Europe has been dealing with, where you don't have assimilation and you start having Sharia law. So it's so difficult to kind of keep both of those in tension. The need for us to protect ourselves from radical Muslims, but also the need to reach out with the love of Jesus Christ to the Muslim friends that we have.
Exactly. It's a very double-edged sword. It's a fine line sometimes.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share with us, and thank you for your service as well. You've had a chance to see some things the rest of us will never have a chance to see, and we really appreciate your service for this country.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Let's keep you on the line because I'd love to send you a copy of my book, and you can tell me what you think about it. So we will take this as an opportunity to say goodbye for the day. We're going to spend some time tomorrow getting into some very important issues. You know that so often what we talk about on this program is not only how to articulate a biblical worldview, but also how to defend a biblical worldview. And some of you might remember back a number of months ago, I had an opportunity to do an interview with Mark Clark, who is a very outstanding pastor in Canada. And he is actually going to be in Dallas tomorrow, so we're going to have him in studio. He has written this outstanding book, which is entitled The Problem of God, Answering a Skeptic's Challenge to Christianity. So, again, we're going to spend a little bit of time in what we call apologetics, so we'll get into that issue with him in studio. Then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. There's certainly a lot to cover, and we will certainly want to educate you about those and get your comments as well. I thank those of you that called in today, and if you would like to join us in the future, don't forget that the number is 800-351-1212. If you would like to give to this ministry, I rarely give out that number, but I should. The pledge line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. So your donation would certainly be helpful to us. And usually in the fall, giving picks up. But lately, giving has been in the fall, kind of like it's been in the summer. So we are certainly in need for your financial support. So if you believe in what we're doing, a special gift would be greatly appreciated. You can find all of that information on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Hank Hanegraaff and Tom Grace for joining us today. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I joke that I'll win the lottery when God blows the winning ticket across a parking lot to me. I don't buy tickets, so if he wants me to win, that's the way. Pretty silly, right? But a lot of us take a similar stance when it comes to the ills of our culture. We don't do anything. We simply hope things will change. I encourage you to get in the game and make things change. Join Truth Team 360 and be part of a work that changes lives and communities. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
From Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me. Ron and Debbie Hall have everything they could ever want, except for a loving marriage. But when Debbie befriends a homeless man, their lives begin to intersect, and they are all changed forever.
Amazing how far a little tender loving care can go.
Same Kind of Different as Me, based on the true story, now playing, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. More information is available at samekindofdifferentasmemovie.com.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to